Hi class, this is Sir Alex again. Welcome to our lesson in General Biology 1. Today we'll be continuing on in our discussion of transport mechanism, and we'll be focusing on our lesson 6.2, which is an example of transport mechanism, more specifically the passive transport. Just a little bit of review. Previously, we've discussed the plasma membrane and the structure of the plasma membrane, as well as some components of it and the function of plasma membrane. We've learned that plasma membrane is very important for in ways that the cell can communicate to other cells or even be able to identify itself as well as move things in and outside of the cell because the plasma membrane separates the extracellular fluid or the fluid surrounding the cell from the intracellular fluid or the fluid inside the cell or in the cytosol. So transport mechanism in cells are very important, has very important functions because one way for the cells to receive, example, one way for the cells to receive nutrients is by transport mechanism, by transporting important materials from the extracellular fluid and into the cytosol. The same way, the way that the cell can remove some of the waste materials from inside is by transport mechanism, wherein it moves things from the cytosol or from the intracellular fluid to the extracellular fluid, so it's exiting the cell. So let's begin first by understanding what would be the goal of today's lesson. It's for us to be able to explain the mechanism of transporting cells, more specifically on how passive transport happens. Passive transport, examples of passive transports include diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated transport. So today we'll be discussing these three as part of our discussion on passive transport. So let's first discuss what is a transport or what is transport across a membrane. So if we imagine a house or if we liken a house or cell into a house, you can think of the plasma membrane as the house's walls. So in our own houses, we have windows on our walls and we have doors. And these windows and doors serves as a passageway for air to come in, for sunlight to come in into our homes, and for us to exit or go in and outside of our houses. The same way with cells. The cell's plasma membrane has or its walls has windows and doors for molecules or particles to come in and outside of the cell. And this is a very important job of the plasma membrane because, like we've discussed in the beginning of our lesson 6, ways cells can communicate in various ways. For example, by sending signals from inside to outside, or it can take nutrients from outside to inside in order for it to survive. So there are a lot of function in transporting molecules in and out, and it's a very important role that the plasma membrane is very good at doing. There are two basic ways for substances can cross across the membrane. Not so there's supposed to be two. So one is a passive transport. So one of the things that I want you guys to remember in passive transport is that it requires no energy. So when we transport materials, we do not need energy to do so. The second one is what we call the active transport, wherein it requires energy before we can move a molecule or a particle from one side to the other side or across the cell membrane. So here's a picture of some examples of passive and active transport. So cell transport, we have passive and active. Under passive, we have simple diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Today we'll be discussing these three and how they happen or what is the mechanism that is undergoing in each of these examples of passive transport. For active transport that we will be discussing later on, we have what we call pumps and vesicular transport or bulk transport. Under pump, we have primary and secondary. For vesicular or bulk transport, we have exocytosis and endocytosis. Under endocytosis, we have pinocytosis, phagocytosis, and receptor mediated. So, for now, let's focus on the passive transport, and then we'll be discussing simple diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. So, what is passive transport? Like I've mentioned, passive transport is a transport of particles or molecules across the plasma membrane, but without any requirement of energy, which is opposite of what active transport is. For passive transport, this happens, or this no requirement of energy happens because the movement of molecules happens through the movement across their concentration gradient. So when we talk about concentration gradient, it's the gradual movement of solute or particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. This is, I hope you guys are familiar about, are familiar um, that molecules or particles or solute always move from an area, or normally move, or should always move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. We'll focus more on discussion later on with this, but let's keep going. So remember that the plasma membrane is selectively permeable. What that means is not everything can cross it. Some particles and some molecules cannot pass through the plasma membrane because of the hydrophobic core of the plasma membrane. If you guys remember the plasma membrane, it is a lipid bilayer. And on the outside of that layer, the heads are facing towards the intracellular and the extracellular fluid. So the heads are outside, while all the tails, the hydrophobic tails, are tucked inside. And these hydrophobic tails or water-faring tails creates this shield, this barrier that does not allow a lot of particles to move easily through it. So some of the what's the word? Some of the exceptions that can easily pass hydrophobic cores includes oxygen and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide and oxygen can easily cross the hydrophobic core and follow the concentration gradient. One thing that cannot easily pass this hydrophobic core are charged and polar molecules. So for example, water cannot just easily pass through the semi-permeable membrane or the plasma membrane. And another things are ions, for example, Na ions or sodium ions and potassium ions cannot just easily pass through the selectively permeable or semi-permeable plasma membrane of the cells. So so here's an example of what I was talking about. So we have it's supposed to be moving. So let me just okay. There you go. So it is moving right here. So as you can see at the beginning, now the concentration of solutes. So think of these pink circles as solutes. Okay. So in the beginning, there are more on this side. But we know that solutes move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. That's called a concentration gradient. And what happens is that an area of high concentration gradient, the solutes will flow towards an area with low concentration gradient. So that is what basically passive transport is. There's a natural movement happening wherein the solutes easily move from their position of high concentration to low concentration. So So that's the fundamental thing that I want you guys to remember about passive transport. So let's begin with the discussion of simple diffusion. Simple diffusion is basically the movement of particles from an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser concentration. Have you guys ever experienced of opening the bleach, and then as you open the bleach, you can suddenly smell the fume, or the you can smell the bleach as you open it, and that is because some of the particles escape, some of the gas particles of that bleach escape that you can actually smell it. The same thing with perfume. If you open a cup of perfume, eventually, for example, if you open a cup of a perfume, you just let it hang open in the air. Eventually, your room will smell of the perfume. That is because perfume are very volatile, so the gas particles will easily escape from the liquid and it will diffuse through your room. That is because there are more concentrations of that perfume onto the bottle and there are less on the surrounding room or in your room. So what happens is that they will start to diffuse, it will start to come out until your room smells like the perfume. So that is what we call basically diffusion. And this happens, it's simply because the molecules are in a constant motion due to their kinetic energy. What that means is that we know that molecules move. We've discussed that a lot of times. And molecules have kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is related to movement. The higher the kinetic energy, the faster the movement. It's just fact that particles move. And because particles move, they have to diffuse through the area. And they diffuse across the concentration gradient. So for example here, so you have an area of higher concentration and it moves an area of lower concentration. That is diffusion. So it's the movement of particles. Once the molecules are equally distributed, they achieve a what we call dynamic equilibrium. So let's focus on this moving picture right here. So as the molecules move from an area of high concentration to lower concentration, it does not mean that once they become equal, the number of solutes here is equal to the number of solutes here. It doesn't mean the movement stop. What happened is a dynamic equilibrium. The movement would be continuous. There would still be some solutes moving here towards here, even though they're already equal. At the same time, there will be some particles moving from here going to this side. Again, this is the time where it is already equal at their, so you can see here they're already at their final state. We're in the solutes here are, for example, we have 10 solutes here and then we have 10 solutes here. So what is happening is there continuous movement of exchange of solute particles. And even though they're moving, what is happening is that the net flow is zero. What that means is that the number of solutes here and the number of solutes here is not increasing kasi parang nag-exchange lang sila. So, nagbigay ito ng isa, magbibigay din ito ng isa, nagbigay ito ng dalawa, magbibigay din ito ng dalawa. That's why we call it dynamic equilibrium. The movement does not stop. It's just that the numbers of solute and the numbers of solute here, once they achieve equilibrium, is it doesn't change. So they can keep moving, but the numbers of solutes does not change. That's what we call dynamic equilibrium. This is where the situation where the net flow of the molecules is zero. Some of the particles that uses simple diffusion are oxygen, carbon dioxide, and lipids. So oxygen, carbon dioxides, and lipids can easily pass the semi-permeable membrane. That is because they're not charged and they're not polar. And this is very important because kapag humihinga tayo, we take in oxygen, tama? And as we breathe oxygen or as we inhale oxygen, it goes into our lungs. And into our lungs, it's actually full of blood vessels. And that blood vessels are made up of epithelial cells. And it separates the blood running into the sacs that are present in our lungs that is being filled with air. And because oxygen is permeable, or um, it passes the plasma membrane, the oxygen that we breathe can easily pass from the lungs into our blood vessels. So I hope that is clear. So um, that's one exact way that is happening into our body on how simple diffusion is very important in the processes of cells. Again, so as we breathe in, this oxygen can easily pass from our lungs and into the blood vessels that are very present, or there's a lot of them in present in our lungs. And that is because the oxygen then can get carried into the bloodstream and then it flows into our body for us to live. The second part that I want to discuss is osmosis and tonicity. So osmosis is a little different from diffusion, albeit it's a very specific type of diffusion. It's still a movement of particles. But this time, instead of moving solutes, we are moving water or solvents. Kanina, yung diffusion, this is the movement of the solutes. Remember, solutes and solvents. Solute yung dinusolve natin, this is solvent. Halimbawa, sugar is your solute and water is your solvent. As for osmosis, this is the movement of the solvent itself. This is the movement of water. When we talk about osmosis, we are not talking about the movement of the solute. We are talking about the movement of the solvent. And the same thing, water or solvents can actually cross their concentration gradient. They can move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Osmolarity is a measure of concentration of a solution expressed as the total number of solutes divided by particles per liter of solution. So let's look at the example here. So as you can see here, on this part on the left, or we have a massive, let's say this is a massive beaker, and we separated it with a selectively permeable membrane. And the water level on this side has low. In fact, it's almost like there's no sugar concentration. Sugar are the green circles, and the water are the blue circles hanging around. And then on the right side, we have higher level of concentration of sugar. So even if the water is level, so kung parehas man sila nung level ng water, dahil meron kang concentration ng sugar dito, mas maliit yung concentration ng solvent mo na tubig. There's lower water concentration. So what happens is that since you have higher water concentration here, the water would flow towards this area. That is because, again, you have lower concentration of solvent. Yung mga solutes mo, which example here, are not moving because this is osmosis. That's what osmosis is. Osmosis is the movement of water. A lot of times it's water, but sometimes it's also different types of solvent, and they move from an area where there is a lower concentration of solvent. So makikita mo, parang bababa yung volume ng tubig dito, tataas siya dito, pero in reality, yung concentration nila is equal, or the concentration of the solvent, or yeah, of the water or the solvent is equal now on both sides. So why is this very important? That is because of what we call tonicity. Tonicity is the ability of a solution to make water move into or out of the cell. So this will become more clearer, so bear with me. So tonicity, again, if we have a solution, for example, we have a solution of water, and this solution, if we put a cell inside it, the solution can affect the cell in various ways, depending on what type of solution you have. So for tonicity, we have three types of solution, what we call the hypertonic. In hypertonic solution, when you add cells into the hypertonic solution, the cell loses water and the cell shrinks. In a hypotonic solution, the cell bloats because water will come in, And in isotonic solution, there would be no net flow because there is an equal set or equal solute volume in both inside the cell and on the solution. So let's look at the moving picture here. So we have three red blood cells and we have hypertonic solution, hypo and isotonic. If we put the red blood cells in hypertonic solution because there are higher concentration of solutes, ang nangyayari parang ganito. It will push out water outside of the red blood cells. So ang mangyayari dahil nawawalan ng tubig yung red blood cells, mag-shrink yung cell. The second part is an hypotonic solution. So if you put an hypotonic solution or red blood cells, so we have red blood cells. You put the red blood cells in hypertonic solutions means there's a higher concentration of solutes compared to the cell, so the cell loses water. So if I have a cell and I put it in a hypotonic solution, it means there's higher concentration of solutes inside the cell. So the water from the solution will go inside the cell and make the cell bloat, and it can actually explode the cell. Isotonic solution, iso meaning equal. There is equal concentration of solute inside the cells and on the solution. So it means there would be no net flow. So nagpapalitan lang sila ng tubig pero yung volume ng tubig nila hindi nagbabago. So why is this important? Because yung mga dextrose na binibigay sa inyo, uh, depending do sa situation ng body nyo, they can give you hypertonic, hypotonic, or isotonic. For example, a person that is losing or keeps vomiting or having diarrhea, that's a good example. So a person that is having diarrhea, they're actually losing a lot of water in their um, they're actually losing a lot of water into their cells kaya nade-dehydrate sila. So kapag nakakilala kayo or especially if you guys work in the medical field, you would experience people that are, dehydrated or they are dehydrated because they're having diarrhea or they keep vomiting. Ang madalas na gagawin ng nurse, the easiest ways is to give you what we call a hypotonic solution. So after giving you a dextrose with an hypotonic solution, dahil kulang nga sa tubig yung cell ninyo, since the solution has lesser solute compared the solutes inside your cells, the cell will intake that solution. So, papasok yung solution dun sa cells ninyo and that will rehydrate you and that will help on your loose bowel movement or on your diarrhea and on your vomiting. So, that's one example on how these solutions are very important in maintaining the balance of the cells. So, that is um, just a real life application in the medical field of tonicity or osmosis in practice. Okay, so I hope it is clear on what osmosis and tonicity is. So that's again one way on how particles move in and out of the cell. This time, instead of having solutes move, we are moving water in and outside of the cell. And lastly, we have what we call a facilitated diffusion. So for facilitated diffusion, it's a little different from simple diffusion because in simple diffusion, cells just easily move across the concentration gradient. For example, carbon dioxide and oxygen can easily move. But for facilitated diffusion, if you guys remember, the polar and the charged molecules does not easily cross the plasma membrane barrier. These types of molecules needs help, and they can get help through what we call facilitated diffusion, wherein the molecules diffuse through the plasma membrane through the help of channel and carrier proteins. Again, the movement is still from the area of from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. Hence, we still require no energy. Pero ang kailangan lang nila is meron kang tunnel. So these channels and these carrier proteins creates a tunnel for these particles to go through the plasma membrane. Kasi ang ginagawa ng channel and carrier is it shields those particles, those charge and those charge or ions and those polar molecules. It protects them from the hydrophobic core of the plasma membrane. So we have channel proteins and carrier proteins. So channel proteins creates a hydrophilic tunnel that allows charge and polar molecules to pass. Kasi remember, yung inside ng plasma membrane natin are hydrophobic tails. So it's a hydrophobic region. And charge and polar molecules cannot pass through a hydrophobic region. So ang gagawin ng channel proteins is it creates a tunnel that is hydrophilic so that charge and polar molecules can pass. Example of these is water. Water is a polar molecule. So in order for water to pass through the membrane of the cell, it needs to pass a channel protein. And there's a specific channel protein that water can pass through, and that's what we call the aquaporins. Aquaporins are channel proteins wherein water molecules can pass through from inside or outside, pass through across inside and outside the cell. And these channel proteins are very selective. Sometimes there's only one type of molecule that they allow, or sometimes there are some but other molecules, but they're very closely related to the type of molecules that they originally allow. Some of the channel proteins are always open, and some are gated or requires a signal for them to open. Okay, so here's an example. So we have your plasma membrane here. This is a hydrophobic. So halimbawa, itong mga particles nito is tubig. Since these are H2O, they are polar molecules, they cannot easily pass across the membrane because of the hydrophobic core. So what they do is this transmembrane protein here creates a shield so that these particles can easily go in and out of the plasma membrane. So that's what channel proteins do. As for carrier proteins, ang ginagawa ng carrier proteins is they change their shape to move target molecules across the membrane. The change in shape happens in response to binding of the molecules. So what does that mean? Later, there's a picture on what is happening. Pero also, similar with channel proteins, they're very typically very selective then. Not all particles or a lot of particles has their own carrier proteins, have their own proteins that they can pass to. Another thing though is that for carrier proteins, it is much slower than the channel proteins, and this is because this is what is happening here. Now it's also not moving, so let's go and move it. Ayun. So as you can see, there is a solute moving inside and it binds into the proteins. And what happens, the protein changes shape and allows for that particle to go inside the cell now. So this is inside the cell and this is outside the cell. So let's do that again. Again, so you have a molecule that is binding onto the protein, and as it binded, the shape of the protein changes and creates and allows for that particle to move inside the cell. So that's what carrier proteins do. If this is lower, it's because it needs to bind and then it changes its shape. After changing its shape and allow for that particle to move inside the cell, it has to reset to its original shape. There you go, and then it will reset after the particle is inside. So carrier proteins are a lot slower than channel proteins, which can always be open or it just requires a signal for it to open. So that is for facilitated diffusion. Okay, so this is what is being used more specifically for charge and polar molecules. So that is what passive transport is. So passive transport includes osmosis, simple diffusion, and facilitated diffusion. And the fundamental knowledge is that it requires no energy for these particles to move, and they always move from a concentration of high concentration to lower concentration. And because of that reason na hindi kailangan ng energy for them to move. So I hope that is clear on what passive transport is. If you guys have any question, do not hesitate to message me. And you guys have a great day.